Welcome to Janus Corporation's IIPP training for torch cutting. Don't ever do this in the lower right-hand corner. Not sure what that guy's thinking. It's a good way to burn your hand. Only trained and authorized personnel are permitted to use torch cutting equipment. Hands-on training for torch cutting is important. You must have hands-on training in order to conduct torch cutting on a Janus project. Never forget that many storage tanks, boiler units, and other metal items may be painted with lead-containing paint or other heavy metal-containing paint. You will need proper PPE for the torch cutting fumes and sparks that are created, even if there is no lead coatings on the objects being cut. Torch operator must have a copy of the appropriate operating instructions for the type and manufacturer of the cutting tool and must follow those directions. Precautions must be taken to prevent the mixture of air or oxygen with flammable gases, except at a burner or in a standard torch. Only approved apparatus, torches, regulators, pressure-reducing valves, acetylene generators, manifolds, etc. may be used. Employees must never open a fuel gas cylinder valve near a source of ignition. Pressure-reducing regulators must be used only for the gas and pressures for which they are intended. Before a regulator is removed, the valve must be closed and the gas released from the regulator. Before hot work is begun, flammable and combustible materials must be removed from the work area as best as possible. Used drums, barrels, tanks, and other containers should be removed from the work area. If these cannot be removed from the work area, these used storage containers must be so thoroughly cleaned that no substances remain that could explode, ignite, or produce toxic fumes. Combustible floors must be kept wet, covered by a damp sand, or protected by fire-resistant shields. Note, fire-resistant poly is not a good drop cloth for torch cutting. It can melt and produce toxic fumes, or it can catch fire, even though it's fire-resistant. Suitable fire extinguishing equipment must be available for immediate use. Fire watchers must be assigned when cutting is performed in locations where a fire might develop, even after the work is finished. Employees exposed to hazards created by torch cutting operations must be protected with personal protective equipment and clothing. It's required that eye protection, helmets, hand shields, and goggles meet appropriate standards. In operations involving beryllium-containing base or filler metals, only supplied air respirators shall be used. The color red is used to identify the acetylene and other fuel gas hose, green for oxygen, and black for inert gases or air hoses. Before using a torch cutter, a check must be made to assure there is adequate ventilation in and where cutting is performed. When working in confined spaces, environmental monitoring tests must be taken and means provided for quick removal of torch cutting workers in case of emergency. One last thing. Many of the same requirements, plus electrical safety issues and more, are required for safe welding and brazing operations. If Janus employees are going to weld or braze, separate and additional training is required. Things to remember. Only trained and authorized personnel are permitted to use torch cutting equipment. If you have not had hands-on training with a torch cutter, you do not have sufficient training to conduct torch cutting on a project. Precautions must be taken to prevent the mixture of air or oxygen with flammable gases, except at a burner or in a standard torch. Employees must never open a fuel gas cylinder valve near sources of ignition. Suitable fire extinguishing equipment must be available for immediate use. Employees exposed to the hazards created by torch cutting operations, thank you for taking Janus Corporation's IIPP training for torch cutting. Please proceed to the quiz.